And so I turned up in Colorado in the Rocky Mountains on a Greyhound bus with $5 in my pocket and found a place called Snow Mountain Ranch, where I went to look for a job. And of course they said to me, can you ski? And I was like, ski? Yes, I'm Scottish. Of course I could ski. We ski everywhere in Scotland. I used to ski to school across the frozen wakes of Loch Necky or something. We ski even when it's not snowing. That's how much we love to ski in Scotland. So yes. And the guy's like, well, it doesn't really matter because you're going to be driving the cleaning van. And I thought, oh, thank God. Then I remembered that I couldn't actually drive, but I thought, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I'll learn as I go along. And I enjoyed Colorado. It was nice. It was very, very isolated. I lived on a log cabin on the top of a mountain. And the only problem with Colorado was that nothing to do. It was so isolated. There was a bar in a tiny town about a few miles away from where I was staying in my log cabin. So I used to go there quite a lot and just to hang out and drink. And one night I found myself staying rather late at the bar and realised it was about 1 o'clock in the morning and the place was empty. So I was like, oh, I got my coat. I was like, right, I'm off. And the bartender was like, you can't do that. You can't do that. And the reason was that Colorado is cold. And in fact, the place where I was staying close to was called Fraser, Colorado, and at one time held the record as the coldest town in America. It got to minus 30, I believe, at one point. And so the barman was like, you go out there, it's in the middle of winter, it's 1 o'clock in the morning, half an hour, tops, and you will freeze to death. So you can't walk. And I was like, but there's nobody else here. Nobody give me a lift. And the barman said, yeah, there is. Just look down at the very end of the bar. I looked round and there's this guy sitting there. And he's like, hi. Oh, no. Okay. He's like, you gotta take the lift. There's no other way for you to get home. So I'm like, okay, can you give me a lift to my house, please? And the guy's like, go Cajonsville. But anyway, so I got in the car with he had a truck, obviously, Colorado, big truck. And we set off down the road. Now, there was two ways to get to my house. There was a winding road through the mountains, through the snow, which led right to my front door. And there was also, not too far from my house, there was a little path that went through the woods. And so we're driving along, and this guy was just like creeping me out. It was like, he kept going, I was like, I tell you what, when we got to the little path, I was like, tell you what, let me out here and I will walk through the little path to my house. No problem. And the guy's like, no. He's like, and I won't bother with his accent, which was all over the place, just like mine. But he basically said, look, remember what the barman said, half an hour outside and you will freeze to death. You don't want to take that chance. I was like, no, I don't, but I don't want to take the chance of driving any further with you either, so just let me out, it's fine, it'll be okay, I promise. I might have thought that through a bit more, but and he was like, okay then, stupid Scotsman, out you go. I found myself in the snow and he drove off. And I was like, that's fine, not a problem at all. I could see the path through the trees, the moon was up high in the sky, so I could see where I was going, and off I set through this path in the woods. Trudging along, somewhat the worse for wear, but properly enthused by the beauty of nature. It really was. I was like, oh, this is fantastic. The wind whistling through the trees, and I could hear a coyote far off in the hills going, oh, and I was like, oh, I'm at one with nature, communing, you might say. This is fantastic. Look at the trees, look at the grass, look at the moon, look at that moose on the path in front of me. Now, I don't know if you know very much about mooses or mises or whatever they're called. And I certainly didn't. But I knew enough to know that mooses, they have long, thin legs. And this thing didn't. And mooses have antlers. And this thing didn't have antlers. It had a big head. And mooses make this kind of noise. And this thing wasn't making that kind of noise at all. It was kind of going... and suddenly realised that it was a bear. Not only was it a bear, it was a grizzly bear, a very large one. Now, at the time I didn't know anything about bears either. I know a lot about them now. I have researched bears vociferously now, and I know a lot about bears. One, they hibernate. Therefore the bear shouldn't have been on the mountain at all. It was far too far down. It should have been much further up, sleeping. And I know also now that if you see a grizzly bear that far down the mountain in the middle of winter, it means that something has woken it up. And usually that's hunger. And so therefore the bear comes down the mountain and it looks for something to eat. And that would be me. Okay, now, do you know what you're supposed to do if you encounter a starving grizzly bear at night in the middle of winter in the woods? Again, I do now, and I knew some of this anyway, just from, and listen, because this might save your life someday. If you find yourself in such a situation, you don't run away, because the bear can run faster than you can. There's no point in climbing a tree, because bears can climb better than we can. What you're supposed to do is puff yourself up as big as you can get, and then you run towards the bear in an effort to scare it off. Now, for a start, no, that wasn't going to happen. And I was pretty sure that no matter how much I puffed myself up, I was not going to be nearly as big as the bear. And as for running towards it, I mean, the bear would be like, lunch. And it's coming right towards me. Fantastic. Here he comes, he's puffed up. Here we go. So I didn't know what to do, so I didn't do anything. I just stood there. And the bear sat there snuffling. And I stood there. And the bear sat there. And I stood there. And the bear sat there. And I was getting very cold. And I looked at my watch. And I was like, 15 minutes? And I remember what the barman said. 30 minutes and you're dead. So... but I was like, I didn't know what else to do, so I just kept waiting. And finally, the bear moved off, up the path, in the direction of my log cabin. So I stood for some more. I looked at my watch again. 25 minutes. And by this time I was like, and I realised, yeah, it was true. I was going to freeze to death. I was going to die unless I walked. And so I set off towards my cabin in the direction that the bear had gone. And finally I got to the clearing, a clearing where my cabin was. No sign of the bear. Good so far. But I wasn't going to walk across that expanse, so I was like, here we go. 1, 2, 3. And I ran for it. Unfortunately, the path obviously had been beaten down, but the clearing was filled with snow and it came up to my knees, so I got about 5 yards and I collapsed because my legs had frozen solid straight into the snow, face down. And I lay there. Oh no. I had no choice, so I started to crawl as fast as I could through the snow. It was up to there. My mouth was frozen, and any second now, I was waiting for this bear to land on my back and just go and sink its teeth into my head. But no, I kept going. I got to the cabin door. No sign of the bear. I was like, yes. Where are my keys? They're in my pocket. And I tried to get the keys out of my pocket, but my hands had frozen solid by this time, so I couldn't get the keys out. So, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, but this time I was crying like a baby. I was like, oh, I can't get the keys out. Eventually, I managed to get the keys in between the palms of my hands and dropped, put them into the door, turned the key, opened the door, fell inside, shut the door. I was like, I'm alive. I'm alive. And of course, the first thing I did was I went to the bathroom to look in the mirror at myself just to make sure I was actually still alive. And I went in and I looked in the mirror. And I don't know if you've seen those horror movies set in the Antarctic, like The Thing, where people freeze to death and they're completely white and frozen. All of me was like that. I was like frozen stiff. And I put my hand at the back where my ponytail was, and it was frozen. I went, and it came off in my hand. It was like a frozen popsicle. I was like, oh my god! And I rubbed the frost off my face, and I was like, oh, my eyebrows, my eyebrows had come off as well because they were frozen solid, and I had no eyebrows. And I was like, oh. And the next day, I went down to the ranger station and walked in and said, guys, there's a grizzly bear loose on the mountain because I encountered it last night. And the ranger was like, now, you're Scottish, so it probably wasn't a bear you saw at all. It was probably a raccoon. A raccoon. I was like, excuse me, it was gigantic. It was most definitely I was a bear. Look, I'd be looking furious if I had any eyebrows. I had to do this. It was a bear. And the guy's like, yeah, don't think so. And then the door opened again and this Australian guy called Leonard came in. He used to be a stripper, but that's a different story. And he was like, and I won't do the Australian accent because I can't. And he was like, hey mate, there's a bear sitting in the middle of the road down there. And the ranger was like, oh, I do apologise, Mr. Henderson. Get your guns. And off they went. And that was me. I was like, okay, that's no. I need to get as far away from snow and isolation and bears as I could possibly get. And besides, how am I going to get rich and famous working in the middle of nowhere in a forest on the top of a mountain? New York. That's where I want to go. New York.